Very excited now to be joined by author Jack L. High. He is the author of a book which recently became a movie. Let's put it up here on the screen. The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, Hermann Goring, Dr. Douglas M. Kelly, and a fatal meeting of minds at the end of World War II. Recently turned into the movie Nuremberg, which I loved. And whenever your people reached out to have you on the show, I was like, we got to do it. And Krystal even actually just watched the movie as well. So, sir, first of all, just tell us a little bit about how did you find this story? You know, I consider myself a historian, a history buff, read a lot of books about the Third Reich, about Goring. I was, even Nuremberg, was never once aware of this relationship. How did you find this story? Why did you decide to write a book about it?
It's a strange story, isn't it? And I came onto it completely by chance. I was working on an earlier book about another psychiatrist. That book's called The Lobotomist. Mm-hmm. And in the course of researching that book, I went over this other psychiatrist's papers and found that he had met the psychiatrist who's the subject of The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. His name was Douglas Kelly. They had met in 1938 at a psychiatric conference. And what struck the other psychiatrist about Dr. Kelly was that Kelly was at this conference not to present a paper or to give a talk. He was there to give a magic show before an audience of captive psychiatrists, which I think is a very brave thing to do. And that caught my interest. And then later I did a little more research and found out about Dr. Kelly's involvement with the Nuremberg defendants and took it from there.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about, you know, the story here. So you have this psychiatrist who's brought in, he's American military psychiatrist, brought in to evaluate these Nazis who were going to stand trial at Nuremberg. And he develops a particular relationship with Goering and also decides to go far beyond the, you know, initial task of, hey, just evaluate whether these guys are psychologically competent to stand trial.
That's exactly right. Dr. Kelly, at the end of World War II, was in the U.S. Army and was in Western Europe because he had been working in field hospitals treating soldiers who today would be diagnosed with PTSD, and doing so quite successfully with his colleagues. And so he was there at the war's conclusion, and the International Military Tribunal, which was the court assembled by the four largest victorious Allied powers, the US, USSR, France, and the UK, wanted to bring in a psychiatrist to evaluate the defendants to determine whether they were mentally fit to stand trial. That's a low, the legal bar of mental fitness is quite low. And so Kelly took on that job, but it was not a very difficult job for a psychiatrist of his caliber, even though he was very young at the time, only 33. And so he decided to assume a much more significant kind of study. He was doing this on his own, completely under the radar. And it was to find out whether these men, who were the top members of the Nazi regime, both military leaders and civilian leaders, whether they shared any kind of psychiatric disorder that could account for their horrible crimes and horrendous behavior before and during the war. So that's what Kelly set out to do. And Hermann Goring, who was the highest ranking of the defendants, immediately captured Dr. Kelly's interest because he had many obvious positive qualities. He was smart, he was funny, and curious, but he also had, of course, dark, dangerous qualities that had helped him rise to the top of the Nazi leadership. And so Kelly spent months working with Goering and the other defendants, testing them using various psychological evaluative tests and giving them IQ tests, and also interviewing them extensively to learn more about how they thought and whether they shared what Kelly speculated might be a Nazi virus, not a real virus, but a shared diagnosis of a disorder.
Yeah, let's get into that. So, the movie, and I don't want to ruin the entire thing, it eventually culminates. There's a lot of high drama and a very, complicated relationship between Kelly and between Goring, and he eventually leaves. He comes back to the United States. He seems to struggle deeply with alcoholism. And at one point, Russell Crowe, portraying Hermann Goring, is like, "You will never forget me." And I sense that this will be a very impactful moment on your own life, to the point where Kelly himself seems to be driven to suicide in perhaps the same method that Hermann Goring killed himself with a cyanide capsule. So this really did consume him. It consumed his life, the very question of his life. What was it about that interaction and the subsequent book? What were his thoughts that shook him so deeply about his relationship with the high Nazi command?
What happened was that his involvement with these German defendants turned his professional and personal world upside down. So what Kelly determined after his study of these men, these notorious guys, was that they did not share any kind of psychiatric disorder. In fact, their personalities all fell within a normal range. They were not insane. They were not monsters. They were not mentally ill. And what did that mean? Well, first of all, for Kelly, this was really frightening, because to him it meant that if normal people within a normal range of personality can behave like this and commit these kinds of crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes against peace, genocide, all of that, then that means there must be people around us all the time who are capable of that. That was truly horrifying to Kelly. And also, more professionally, it showed him that his medical specialty, psychiatry, could not explain people like this. If so, what could? And so Kelly began a search when he returned to the States to find a way to look at these men. But you're right, his life began a downward spiral once his book, 22 Cells in Nuremberg, came out in 1947. And then Kelly began to experience difficulty, drinking problems, difficulties in his marriage, depression, all of that. All of that contributed to his eventual suicide in 1958.
Now, in the movie, there's a scene where he's trying to sound the alarm bells of, hey, you all think these, German Nazis are so different. They're not so different. This could happen here, and this is not taken well by the I think radio interviewers at the time. Did he try to sound the alarm? Is that something that happened historically in real life?
Absolutely, it did. So in Kelly's book, he wrote about the dangers that he felt were facing American democracy, not just in America, but in all democracies. And then also he spoke widely in lectures and other kinds of presentations. And one curious, maybe predictable thing about all this is that the public did not take to his ideas.
Right.
The public preferred to think of the Nazis as monsters or madmen, and that's understandable. This horrible, bloody war had just lasted 6 years with tens of millions of people dead as a result. And a series of trials were underway as Kelly was publishing his book, these 13 Nuremberg trials. And people wanted to believe that these actions might stop the rise of authoritarian movements, Nazism, fascism, things like that. And to hear a man who is there saying, no, it's not going to, they're around us all the time, that was bad news and unwelcome news.
Yeah, it is interesting that at that time there was this mystique that only they could have done it. I've read a decent, actually the movie, your book also inspired me to buy a few more biographies of Goring. And you come across somebody who is simultaneously boorish and also deeply comfortable in aristocratic circles, hanging out with the Kaiser's son, throwing these great dinners. And he always found Hitlerism and anti-Semitism in particular kind of embarrassing for this crew, but he would also, fanatically flame that when in the presence of Hitler. To me, he just came across as a maniacal narcissist, and I couldn't really tell if he ever believed in anything. But that seems to be the exact characteristic of somebody who rises to power in any system, democratic, authoritarian, or otherwise. I'm curious for your view, since you've read more than I have.
What Kelly came to believe, and I share his view, what he came to believe about all these men is that they were opportunists, that they were, as Goering said, willing to walk on over the backs of a large number of people to gain control over the rest of the people. And so these ideological points of Nazism, the anti-Semitism, and the rest of it, these were stepping stones. Goering claimed not to be an anti-Semite, but I think you have to take that with a huge grain of salt, maybe a boulder of salt, because look at his actions. He certainly behaved as an anti-Semite. And at this point, when Kelly was talking with him, he was developing his defense in this international military tribunal. And his defense would be that he and his colleagues behaved patriotically out of loyalty to Hitler, not out of hate and warmongering. In the end, the court didn't accept that defense, and many of them were put to death, and many others were given long sentences. Only 3 were acquitted.
So then, since Kelly can't really locate, a psychological virus that infects these particular Germans and causes them to behave in just unbelievably monstrous ways, does he situate the Holocaust and Nazism more in sort of the historical conditions, and that's what enables the rise of these particular monstrous people and these particularly monstrous actions? How does he sort of come to, okay, this is why this unbelievably horrible thing happened at this particular point in time?
Kelly postulated that events were ripe for people like Goering and the rest to take advantage of the opportunities to rise for power. And Kelly was adamant that fascism, Nazism, was not a German thing, was not an Italian or Japanese thing, that it was a thing of the human race, and that, of course, not everybody is capable of crimes like this, but there are always significant people in any society, any era, who are capable of it. And some of them will go into politics and governance, some will go into business, they will go into every human endeavor and behave not murderously all the time, but behave viciously in their attempts to seize the opportunities that they see before them.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate you joining us. I loved the movie. As I said, it really inspired me to do my own research. I hope everybody goes and buys your book. It's a fascinating story, even if you were already deeply familiar. And thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you guys so much for watching. We appreciate it. Look, the show's going to be late today. It is what it is. It was a great show, though, I thought. You got a debate. It had the news, had an interesting author from World War II. So that's the best of Breaking Points, all right? And we apologize for that. Friday show for tomorrow. We'll see you then. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show, ad-free, and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.